Gunshots echoing through a deserted Chicago parking garage are usually a death sentence. For Pugan, a heavy-set cleaner just trying to finish her night shift, they were the start of a dangerous collision. One dying mafia boss, one raised gun, and a faded wrist tattoo that changed everything. Pugan Hughes knew the exact measure of her invisibility. At 32 years old, standing 5'5" and carrying 280 pounds, she had long ago realized that society had two ways of dealing with fat women. They were either the punchline of a cruel joke, or they were completely erased from the landscape. For Pugan, the latter had become her reality, a thick armor woven from polyester uniforms and averted glances. It was 2:15 a.m. on a stormy Tuesday in downtown Chicago. The relentless rain battered the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Oak Haven Financial Building, a towering monument of glass and steel situated right off Harrison Street. The rest of the city was asleep, but Pugan was on her hands and knees, scrubbing a coffee stain out of the imported Persian rug in the CEO's office. Her knees protested with a dull, familiar ache, bearing the heavy weight of her body. Her generic blue work shirt, a size 3XL, that was still somehow tight across her broad stomach and wide hips, clung to her skin with a light sheen of sweat. Pugan didn't hate her body, though the world constantly told her she should. It was strong. It carried her through grueling 12-hour shifts, pushed overloaded cleaning carts across acre-sized floors, and survived on a diet of cheap carbohydrates and whatever discount groceries her landlord, Mrs. Gable, occasionally left on the stairs. But tonight, the sheer physical toll of existing was dragging her down. She grunted as she pushed herself up from the floor, leaning heavily on the wooden desk of Mr. Thomas Abernathy, a man who regularly threw away more money in unopened gourmet lunches than Pugan made in a month. She grabbed her spray bottle of lemon cleaner, the sharp, artificial citrus scent burning her nostrils, a smell she could never scrub out of her skin, no matter how much cheap soap she used at home in her cramped South Loop apartment. Just the basement left, Pugan, she muttered to herself, her voice thick and gravelly in the suffocating silence of the 42nd floor. Just the garage, and then you can go home. She tossed her rags into the yellow bucket, the water murky and grey. The building's night security guard, a kindly but lethargic man named Gary, was likely asleep at the front lobby desk. It was just Pugan and the ghosts of corporate greed echoing through the empty halls. She wheeled her heavy cart toward the service elevator. The metal doors opened with a sluggish groan, and she pushed the cart inside, hitting the button for the sub-basement. This was the VIP parking level, a concrete bunker reserved exclusively for the firm's top executives and their ultra-wealthy clients. It was usually empty by this hour, save for a few luxury cars left overnight. As the elevator descended, the polished mahogany panels of the upper floors gave way to the brutalist, grey concrete of the underground levels. The air grew significantly colder, smelling of damp earth, motor oil, and exhaust. The elevator jolted to a halt, the doors sliding open to reveal the dimly lit, cavernous expanse of the garage. Flickering fluorescent lights cast long, distorted shadows against the structural pillars. Pugan stepped out, her thick rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the slick concrete. She grabbed her mop, preparing to do her standard sweep of the VIP elevator lobby. But something was wrong. The heavy silence of the underground structure was broken by a rhythmic, metallic ticking, the sound of a cooling car engine. It was close. Pugan stopped, her grip tightening on the aluminum handle of her mop. She peered around a massive concrete pillar. About 50 yards away, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a dying halogen bulb, sat a black Lincoln Navigator. The driver's side door was hanging wide open. The window was entirely blown out, shards of tempered safety glass glittering on the concrete like a blanket of spilled diamonds. Her breath hitched in her chest. The steady hum of the ventilation system suddenly sounded like a roaring jet engine in her ears. Pugin knew she should turn around. She knew she should get back into the elevator, press the lobby button, wake Gary, and call the police. That was the rule of the city. Mind your business, keep your head down, stay invisible. But then she heard it. A wet, ragged gasp. The sound of someone choking on their own fluids, followed by the heavy, dragging scrape of a shoe against the floor. Someone was alive down there. Every instinct told her to run, but Pugin's feet remained planted. Beneath her soft, heavy exterior was a woman who knew what it meant to be discarded and left to suffer alone. She couldn't just walk away. Swallowing the hard lump of terror in her throat, she abandoned her cleaning cart. She moved with surprising stealth, her large frame slipping from pillar to pillar, the shadows of the garage swallowing her completely. The scent hit her before she even rounded the final corner. It wasn't oil or exhaust. It was the heavy, metallic, sickeningly sweet stench of fresh carnage. Pugin peeked around the reinforced concrete column of parking space A1. Two men in dark suits lay motionless near the front tires of the Lincoln, their limbs splayed in unnatural, broken angles. Dark, pooling liquid crept toward the drainage grate. Her hands began to tremble violently. This wasn't a mugging. This was a professional hit. A few feet away from the wreckage, crawling agonizingly toward the exit ramp, was a third man. I was leaving a thick, dark smear across the pale concrete with every inch he gained. Pugin took a tentative step forward. Her shoe came down on a rogue shard of glass. It snapped with a sharp crack that echoed like a firecracker through the silent garage. The crawling man froze. Despite the severe trauma of his injuries, his survival instincts were terrifyingly intact. In a blur of motion that defied his battered state, the man rolled onto his back. His right arm snapped up, supported by his left hand, and leveled a massive matte black handgun with a suppressed barrel directly at Pugin's chest. Pugin let out a strangled cry and threw her hands up in the air, freezing in the open. "Don't shoot!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Please, I'm just the cleaner." The man holding the gun was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under a ruined, blood-soaked Armani suit. Even in the dim light, Pugin recognized the sharp, patrician features, the slicked-back dark hair, and the piercing, cold eyes that had stared back at her from the front pages of the Chicago Tribune. It was Lorenzo Bianchi, the untouchable head of the Bianchi crime syndicate, a man whose name was whispered with equal parts reverence and terror in the city's underworld. Lorenzo's eyes were glassy with pain, his face pale and slick with a deathly sweat. Blood poured from a devastating wound in his left side, soaking his expensive white dress shirt. But his hand, gripping the heavy pistol, was dead steady. He had the cold, detached look of a predator making a final, calculated decision to eliminate a witness. "Step into the light," Lorenzo rasped, his voice a gravelly whisper laced with a thick, aristocratic Italian accent. Pugin obeyed, her thick thighs trembling so violently She thought her knees would buckle under her weight. She stepped fully into the yellow glow of the overhead lamp, her arms still raised high. Her oversized blue uniform shirt shifted with the movement, the right sleeve sliding down her plump arm, exposing the pale skin of her inner wrist. Lorenzo's finger tightened on the trigger. He took a shallow breath, preparing to end her life. But as his eyes tracked her movement, his gaze locked onto her exposed wrist. 15 years ago, Pugan had saved an old, homeless man from freezing to death in a South Side alley. In return for a bowl of hot soup and a blanket, the eccentric dying man, who claimed to be a disgraced tattoo artist for the old world elites, had forcefully insisted on giving her a mark. He used a needle and blue ink he carried in a battered tin, claiming it was a ward of ultimate protection. Pugan had let him do it out of pity. The result was a strange, intricate crest, a jagged iron crown deeply intertwined with a weeping blue rose. Lorenzo stared at the tattoo, the cold, murderous resolve in his dark eyes, instantly fractured, replaced by absolute, paralyzing shock. His breathing stopped. The heavy pistol in his hand began to shake. "The sovereign's debt," Lorenzo whispered, the words slipping from his bloody lips like a prayer. He stared at Pugan, really looking at her for the first time. He didn't see a fat cleaning lady. He saw the emblem branded into her flesh. An emblem that belonged to a ghost story his father had told him. A marker of absolute sanctuary in the Mafia underworld, granted to only one bloodline. "How?" Lorenzo coughed, a violent spasm that racked his broken body, sending a fresh wave of crimson spilling over his hands. "How do you bear the blue rose?" Pugan was too terrified to speak. She just stood there, her large chest heaving, tears of absolute terror streaming down her flushed cheeks. Lorenzo's strength finally gave out. The shock of the tattoo had broken his adrenaline-fueled focus. The massive handgun slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the concrete floor. His eyes rolled back into his head, and his head hit the ground with a sickening thud. Silence returned to the basement. Pugan stood frozen for a full 10 seconds. "Run!" her brain screamed. "He's the Mafia. He's going to bring a war here. Leave him." She lowered her arms, looking at her wrist. The faded blue rose seemed to mock her. She looked back at Lorenzo Bianchi, the most dangerous man in Chicago, now bleeding out on the floor of her workplace. If she left him, he would die in exactly 3 minutes. And if the men who shot him came back to check their work, they would find her cart. They would find her. Pugan made a decision that would forever alter the course of her life. She didn't run. She hurried over to Lorenzo, dropping to her knees beside him. Up close, the damage was horrific. I was a large, heavily muscled man, dead weight and rapidly fading. A smaller, frailer woman would have been useless. But Pugan was not small. She gritted her teeth, sliding her thick, powerful arms under his armpits. She planted her sturdy feet flat on the concrete. Channeling years of heavy lifting, of carrying her own substantial mass, of pushing industrial equipment up ramps, Pugan let out a guttural yell and hoisted Lorenzo Bianchi off the floor. I was agonizingly heavy, his expensive shoes dragging on the ground. But Pugan's broad back and powerful thighs took the strain. She dragged him backward, away from the blood trail, moving toward the heavy steel door of the industrial boiler room 50 feet away. Her lungs burned, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But she didn't stop until she hauled him over the threshold. She kicked the steel door shut just as the horrifying screech of tires echoed down the exit ramp. The killers had returned to finish the job. The industrial boiler room of the Oakhaven Financial Building was a claustrophobic cavern of violently hissing pipes, enormous steel tanks, and the suffocating smell of sulfur and heated copper. Poogan dragged Lorenzo Bianchi's limp body behind a massive humming generator, her thick thighs burning from the tremendous physical exertion. She lowered him gently onto the grated iron floor, her chest heaving as she fought to quiet her own ragged breathing. Outside the heavy steel door, the screech of tires was immediately followed by the slamming of car doors and the frantic, echoing slap of footsteps on concrete. "Check the cars! Check the stairwells!" A brutal, raspy voice barked out in the garage. "He took a hit to the liver. He can't have made it far. Find him, or the Moretti family is going to put our heads on pikes." Poogan's blood ran cold. The Moretti Syndicate. Even an invisible cleaner like Poogan, who spent her life ignoring the news and trying to survive on the margins, knew that name. They were the ruthless, upstart rivals tearing through Chicago's West Side, leaving a trail of bodies in their wake. She looked down at Lorenzo. The pool of dark blood expanding beneath him was terrifying. If she didn't stop the bleeding right now, the most feared Don in the city would die quietly in a puddle of dirty water, and Poogan would be the only witness left for the Moretti hitmen to clean up. Panic threatened to paralyze her, but survival kicked in. Poogan possessed a deep, pragmatic resilience forged by years of hard labor and making do with absolutely nothing. She couldn't afford to be delicate. She grabbed the hem of her oversized blue polyester uniform shirt and yanked violently. The cheap fabric tore away, popping the buttons, leaving her in a thick white cotton tank top that clung to her broad torso. She balled up the uniform shirt, pressing it with all her considerable strength directly against the weeping wound on Lorenzo's side. Lorenzo's eyes flew open. He let out a suppressed, agonizing hiss, his back arching off the grate. His left hand shot out, his fingers weakly clamping around Poogan's thick wrist, right over the faded blue rose. "Quiet," Poogan breathed, her voice trembling but surprisingly firm. "They are right outside." Lorenzo's dark, feverish eyes locked onto hers in the dim, red emergency lighting of the boiler room. The haze of pain in his expression shifted into something intensely focused. He was a man who traded in power, dominance, and control, yet here he was, broken and bleeding, entirely at the mercy of a 280-pound night cleaner. He didn't see weakness in her soft curves or her heavy frame. He felt the unyielding, grounded strength of her arms pressing down on his wound, keeping his lifeblood inside his body. Footsteps approached their sanctuary. The heavy, measured thud of tactical boots echoed just inches from the other side of the boiler room door. Poogan immediately abandoned her pressure hold. She scrambled silently to the steel door, placing her broad back firmly against the cold metal. She planted her sturdy, rubber-soled work boots against the raised concrete lip of a nearby drainage pipe. Poogan weighed nearly 300 pounds, and in that terrifying moment, she used every single ounce of her mass as a human barricade. She tightened her core, turning herself into an immovable anchor of flesh and bone. The handle turned with a sharp clack. A heavy shoulder slammed against the exterior of the door. The metal vibrated against Poogan's spine, but the door didn't budge a single millimeter. Poogan gritted her teeth, her thick leg muscles locking tight, her face flushed red with exertion. Doors jammed, A muffled voice grunted from the garage. "Probably locked from the inside. Maintenance only." "Leave it," the raspy leader commanded. "Look at this blood trail. It ends at the exit ramp." One of his guys must have pulled up and grabbed him. Back in the van. "We need to scrub the traffic cameras on Harrison Street before the cops get here." Tires squealed once more, followed by the fading echo of a roaring engine. Pugin held her position for 5 agonizing minutes, the sweat dripping from her forehead, before she finally let her muscles relax. She slid down the door, letting out a long, shaky breath, and crawled back to Lorenzo. He was watching her, completely mesmerized. "You?" Lorenzo rasped, a bloody smile touching the corners of his pale lips. "You are built like a fortress, Mia Salvatrice." Pugin blushed furiously, her cheeks burning hot. No man had ever spoken to her like that. Not with a tone of quiet awe, and certainly not a man who looked like he had stepped off the cover of a GQ magazine, blood-soaked or not. "I need to get you an ambulance," Pugin deflected, grabbing the bloody uniform shirt and pressing it back into his side. "No hospitals," Lorenzo choked out, his hand wrapping around hers again, his thumb brushing over the jagged crown of her tattoo. "The Morettis own the cops in this precinct. They will finish the job in the ER." "Then what do I do?" Pugin pleaded, tears of frustration prickling her eyes. "You are dying, Mr. Bianchi." "You know who I am," he stated. It wasn't a question. "And yet you didn't run. You carry the blue rose. Who gave this to you?" "A homeless man," Pugin blurted out, crying now. 15 years ago, off Roosevelt Road. I gave him soup. He gave me a tattoo. He said it would protect me. It's just stupid ink. Please, you need a doctor." Lorenzo let out a weak, breathy laugh that ended in a violent cough. "A homeless man. Dio mio. Arthur Callahan, the exiled boss of bosses. He disappeared 2 decades ago. The commission assumed he was dead, and he gave his proxy, his sovereign debt, to a cleaner with a heart of gold." Lorenzo's grip on her wrist tightened with a sudden, desperate strength. "My car is ruined. Take me to yours. We go to Pilsen. 14th Street and Ashland. Dr. Pendleton. Can you carry me, my fortress?" Pugin looked at the dying mafia boss, then at her own shaking, blood-stained hands. The invisibility cloak she had worn her entire life was gone. She nodded. The torrential rain of the Chicago night was a blessing in disguise. It washed the bloody tire tracks away and kept the streets completely deserted. Pugin's 2008 Chevy Impala, a rusted, pale yellow monstrosity that perpetually smelled of stale vanilla air fresheners, barreled down Wacker Drive. In the passenger seat, Lorenzo Bianchi was barely clinging to consciousness. Pugin drove with white-knuckled intensity, her large hands gripping the steering wheel as she broke every speed limit between the Loop and the Pilsen neighborhood. "Stay with me," Pugin ordered, her voice cutting through the rhythmic thumping of the broken windshield wipers. "Don't you dare die in my car, Mr. Bianchi. I can't afford the detailing." Lorenzo's head lolled toward her, his dark eyes half-lidded. "Lorenzo," he murmured. "Call me Lorenzo, and I wouldn't dream of inconveniencing you, Pugin." She had told him her name while hauling him up the service stairs to the staff parking lot. Hauling him had been a monumental task. But Pugin's body, the very thing she had been taught to hide away, was the only reason they were both alive. She slammed on the brakes as they arrived at 14th and Ashland. The location was a discreet, unassuming brownstone with heavily tinted windows and reinforced steel doors. It looked like an abandoned real estate office, but Lorenzo had assured her it was a fully equipped, underground trauma clinic for the Bianchi syndicate. Poogan didn't wait for permission. She threw the car into park, rushed around to the passenger side, and practically carried Lorenzo up the concrete steps. She hammered her heavy fist against the steel door. Seconds later, the door was yanked open by a mountain of a man, wearing a tailored suit that strained over his biceps. This was Dominic, Lorenzo's ruthless underboss. His eyes widened in horror at the sight of his Don, soaked in blood, being held up by a soaking wet, heavy-set woman in a torn white tank top and blue work pants. Before Poogan could speak, Dominic's hand blurred to his waistband. In a fraction of a second, the cold steel barrel of a Glock was pressed directly against Poogan's forehead. "Who the hell are you?" Dominic snarled, his finger whitening on the trigger. "If you set him up, I'll blow your brains out right here on the stoop." Poogan froze, the terror returning in full force. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blast. "Stand down." Lorenzo's voice was a weak, wet rattle, but it carried the absolute, unquestionable authority of a king. "Boss, she could be a Moretti spy." "I said stand down, Dominic," Lorenzo roared, the effort causing blood to bubble at his lips. He leaned heavily on Poogan, raising his shaking left hand and pointing at Poogan's right wrist, which was wrapped tightly around his waist to support him. Dominic's furious gaze flicked from Poogan's face down to her exposed wrist. The air in the doorway seemed to freeze. Dominic's eyes blew wide. The murderous rage on his face evaporated, replaced by an expression of profound, religious shock. He recognized the weeping blue rose intertwined with the jagged iron crown. Every high-ranking made man in the country knew the legend of the mark. It was a decree from the old commission, a mark of ultimate sanctuary. The bearer of the blue rose could not be touched, could not be harmed, and their word superseded that of any Don. Dominic's hand began to shake. Slowly, as if moving underwater, he lowered the gun. Then, astonishingly, the massive, violent mobster took a step back and bowed his head in deep, terrified respect. "Forgive me," Dominic whispered to Poogan. Poogan was too stunned to process the surreal scene. "Just help me get him inside to the doctor," she yelled, her maternal, protective instincts overriding her fear. Dr. Arthur Pendleton, a disgraced former ER surgeon, was waiting in the makeshift operating room for the next 3 hours. Poogan sat on a leather sofa in the safe-house waiting room, covered in Lorenzo's blood, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket Dominic had gently placed over her shoulders. The men in the house treated her not as a fat, invisible cleaner, but as if she were a visiting queen. They brought her hot coffee, averted their eyes respectfully, and spoke to her only when spoken to. Just before dawn, Dr. Pendleton emerged, wiping his bloody hands on a towel. "He's stabilized. The bullet missed his kidney by a fraction of an inch. He lost a lot of blood, but he's strong. He's asking for you, Miss Poogan." Poogan stood up, her exhausted muscles screaming in protest. She walked into the recovery room. Lorenzo was lying on a hospital bed, hooked up to an IV and a heart monitor. He looked pale, but the deadly, predatory sharpness had returned to his dark eyes. He watched her approach, his gaze tracing the soft, heavy curves of her figure, the messy bun of her hair, and finally resting on the blue rose on her wrist. "You saved my life, Poogan Hughes," Lorenzo said softly. "I was just In the right place, at the right time, she deflected, suddenly feeling incredibly self-conscious under his intense stare. She crossed her arms over her stomach. I should go. Gary, the security guard, is probably looking for my cleaning cart. You are not going back to Oakhaven Financial, Lorenzo stated, his voice ringing with quiet finality. You are not going back to a life of scrubbing floors while the world pretends not to see you. I see you, Pugan. He reached out his hand. Hesitantly, Pugan placed her hand in his. His thumb stroked her knuckle. The mark you bear, Lorenzo explained softly, means the entire Mafia underworld owes you a life debt. You are untouchable, but beyond the ink on your skin, you have proven to possess more strength, more courage, and more loyalty than any soldier in my family. Lorenzo pulled her hand slightly closer, pressing a gentle, lingering kiss to the back of her palm. The touch sent a shock wave of electricity straight to Pugan's heart. The invisible woman is gone, Lorenzo vowed, his dark eyes burning with a dangerous possessive heat. From this day forward, you are under my protection, and heaven help the man who dares to look away when you walk into a room. Pugan looked into the eyes of the most dangerous Don in Chicago, realizing with a terrifying, thrilling certainty that her quiet, lonely life was over forever. She hadn't just saved a mafia boss. She had claimed him. Pugan thought she was just an invisible cleaner, but a 15-year-old tattoo has just made her the absolute queen of the Chicago underworld. Lorenzo is saved, but with the ruthless Moretti family out for blood, how long can they survive? And is this the start of an epic, steamy romance between the curvy cleaner and the lethal Don? If you loved this intense, action-packed love story, smash that like button, share the video, and subscribe for more thrilling audio stories. Drop a comment below. What should Pugan order Lorenzo's Mafia to do first?